establishing about 600 forecourts since they first started business here in 1902, oil giant Shell will now be pulling out of South Africa. Shell confirmed it intends to divest its shareholding, saying it is reviewing the downstream and renewable businesses across all regions and markets. Shell Downstream SA was formed after Shell South Africa and black empowerment company Thebe Investment Corporation agreed a decade ago to merge Shell South Africa marketing and Shell South refining businesses. Thebe held a 28% equity stake. But let's unpack what this means with independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Now, Khaya, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. This is such a complex one, and it goes back, we're talking about a history here that goes all the way back to 1902. But just your initial understanding of what the news essentially means when we hear that Shell is divesting from its downstream operations, and perhaps an opportunity for you to help us and motorists in South Africa to really understand what that means and how it impacts them.
Good morning to the viewers. So unfortunately, there's been a conflation of two stories that essentially need to be distinguished. The first one is obviously the story involving Thebe and Shell. And this is a story that's been building over the past couple of years, where Shell and Thebe have been trying to engage on the question of how Thebe can divest its 28% stake. So Thebe took the view a couple of years ago that they actually wanted to sell a part or all of that stake. And the problem that then emerged was the simple question of how that stake ought to be valued. And that is a matter that remains unresolved today. And at the same time, obviously, then the new developments were that Shell actually then decided that, having looked at its entire global footprint and its portfolio of assets, they've decided that this is the one part of the business in South Africa that they wanted to exit from. And of course, the question of why they've reached that decision now is a question that really talks to the entire strategic outlook of Shell at large, and obviously how it's decided to deal with particular assets that it already holds. And whether obviously this is a type of decision that would have happened with or without the confusion and the conflict around the Thebe BE stake is something that only Shell and Thebe can explain. But unfortunately, right now, it seems that we've ended up conflating the two conversations, which is very confusing for a lot of people. But I think obviously, whatever Shell decides to do, it's very clear that the use of fuel or the purchase of fuel by you and I is something that's going to carry on. So the forecourts and the garages that we're talking about are probably going to end up being snapped by another player, depending on whether the fundamentals or the business transaction is indeed appetizing to whoever's willing to buy.
Okay, and I think that's a really good point, because then what we're able to do is then focus on the latter. Because obviously with the upcoming elections, there's the fear that Shell is making this move because of a fear of economic stability or instability post the 29th of May elections. Many pundits saying that's not actually the reason.
Yeah, that is actually quite a lot of nonsense. It is very clear that whatever happens after the 29th of May, the economic policy orientation that the ANC has been running for the past 30 years is still going to emerge as the economic policy orientation of the country. And the reason we're comfortable in saying that is that it is quite simply inconceivable that the ANC will be not only dislodged from power, but will be dislodged to such an extent that whoever emerges will have the capacity and the power to overturn and overhaul all of the ANC's policies that have been put together over the past 80 years. So those that are responsible for making decisions about how to invest in businesses and how to allocate capital are the type of people that are patient and smart enough to be able to study the country's policy dimensions and policy paradigm, and to be able to then say, we are going to invest or not invest based on this. So there isn't a scenario where after the 29th of May, there's someone who arrives in parliament a week or a month after and simply says that every single economic rule and economic regulation that exists in South Africa is going to be overhauled. That simply means that those that have made decisions are still going to have to use the same playbook. And of course, if somebody is making a decision ahead of 29 May to say they were going to leave the country based on the speculation of what might not happen, that is probably not the type of person that you put in front of the shareholders and other stakeholders and say that this is a person responsible for making long-term decisions. Because obviously, if they are so myopic in assuming that South Africa is about to become a completely lawless country after the 29th of May, they probably don't have a very deep understanding of what might happen in the electoral outcome, and more importantly, how it influences the country's policy orientation and policy design process, which is very truncated in nature.
Yeah, that's quite eye-opening. Thanks for that. So what we're looking at then is Shell making its decisions not just based on what's happening in South Africa, but certainly in various parts of the world as well. So Shell recently having disposed of its downstream business also in Pakistan. This is to Saudi Arabia's Wafi Energy. Tell me this, and of course I'm going to try and get with the lower hanging fruit here, where a lot of us are able to, string, I suppose, the logic together. How much of this has to do with the massive geopolitical power shifts that are taking place, certainly the tensions in the Middle East and even between Russia and Ukraine? Is this a geopolitical issue that is trickling down to Shell's business?
No. So the way businesses of a nature like Shell tend to operate is that they would have many, many years ago already had a canvas of the potential risks associated with the different markets that they operate in. So Shell is not the type of company that wakes up today surprised that something has happened in some geopolitical context. They essentially hire people to predict those scenarios for them and to then advise them on how to respond to those potential issues in those different markets. So this is not the type of business that essentially works on surprises. It wouldn't have lasted as long as it has if it worked like that. So what you've obviously seen in the past couple of years is that perhaps the intensity of these geopolitical shocks has been much more acute. But ironically, it is in the oil industry where the benefits seem to always accrue, because as you will have seen, particularly at the height, at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, obviously oil companies were the ones that everybody said, well, actually, there's going to be potential shortages out here. So therefore, the price of oil tended to spike. So the oil industry is a very different market altogether in that it tends to have this strange benefit that happens when there are these particular shifts in these particular conflicts.
Yeah.
And the reason that matters is, again, until we get the CEO of Shell to sit in the room and talk us through their entire strategic outlook and the decisions that they've made, we are going to be fixated on assuming that South Africa is as big a player in the Shell playbook as it is. I personally don't think that, South African market and the South African revenues are the type of thing that actually swing decisions in the Shell boardroom. But what is quite important is for us to be able to then say, well, is this a business that has already been engaging in these conversations across its different markets? And if so, is this just another tick in the box? Or is this an exception? Is this an outlier? Are we looking at a company that has said we're doing things in one way in everywhere else and we're doing things differently in South Africa? Because if that is the case, then would say that we've got a South African problem. But at this stage, it's simply a matter of the decision-making and the strategic reorientation of that business, having said, well, actually, perhaps the margins in that part of that business in South Africa do not warrant the risk that we've addressed, so therefore let us move away from it.
So, all right. So, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think South Africans would like to think of themselves as, a role player that matters to big multinationals. But it's interesting that you put that idea forward. If you were the CEO of Shell Global, what would the next opportunities be then when you see yourself divesting from the 600 forecourts in South Africa and in other parts of the world?
Again, the 600 isn't even a majority of what we see in South Africa. So this is a conversation that is probably being amplified much more than what it should be.
Okay.
But I think obviously the responsibility that the global CEO of Shell has to do, he has to be able to articulate to the various stakeholders that the reason we're taking these particular decisions is because you as shareholders, you and stakeholders have agreed on this particular strategy. And if this strategy says that we must only remain invested in markets that have this particular risk profile, we must only remain invested in markets that generate these particular returns, then this is the reason we've decided to undertake this particular action in the South African context. I think it would be very helpful if the Shell communications team were in a position to give us much more insights into how long this decision has been in the pipeline, no pun intended, and much more importantly, what it is that they are trying to articulate to the South African market, because obviously we now know that there's been this hysteria and this backlash about the timing of what they've done and the question about the BE issue relating to Thebe and everything else in between. And it's just quite unfortunate, because obviously it is not in Shell's interest for this confusion to linger on. It is in their best interest for them to be very clear about what exactly it is that has led to this particular decision. And of course, we cannot do much about the timing. The elections are always going to happen at some point in time. So one cannot dictate to companies that they shouldn't make decisions because South Africa has decided that the 29th of May is an election day.
We have to talk about the immediate concern for many South Africans, and that is jobs. What's at stake, how bad it could be, and what needs to be done to save the many jobs that are within Shell?
Well, again, at this stage, we do not know if there are even jobs at risk, because it simply is a matter of Do we take the view that because Shell has decided that it doesn't want to be the operator of this garage that you see in your neighborhood, does that mean that absolutely nobody else will be willing to operate that garage? And I do not share that view. And the reality here is that the problem that we have with this particularly highly regulated fuel industry is that a lot of people say, well, actually, perhaps we should deploy our capital elsewhere. And that seems to be the decision that Shell has taken. I think if one then looks at the business fundamentals or whether there's enough foot traffic that warrants the continued existence of a particular garage, for example, you will find someone out there who's willing to say, well, actually, I'm happy to be an operator in this particular market. I'm happy to take over these particular assets. So I do not think it is the type of situation where suddenly you're going to see all 600 suddenly closing down overnight because people do not want fuel anymore. That's not the case.
Yeah.
People are still going to want fuel. And I think, obviously, the way some of these stations have been created is that they offer proximity to their immediate market. So those people are still going to prefer to buy fuel at the closest location rather than saying, well, actually, I do not like Shell or do not like the things that they've said, so therefore I'm going to drive further. South Africans just do not think like that. I want to buy fuel, and I'm not particularly fixated on who the identity of the seller is.
Yeah. All right. An absolute pleasure speaking to you, Khaya, and thank you so much for bringing us clarity on that discussion. Khaya Sithole is an independent analyst speaking to us there. We'll still